The first questions have to do with authorship. And a couple of people are asking, when we ask the question, did Paul write Ephesians? What do we mean by write? Is there a consistent definition of this concept across the Bible?
That's a great question, because we see in one or two of Paul's letters that he's used a scribe. There's famously at the end of Romans, suddenly when Paul is giving greetings to people, we have a little line saying, I, Tertius, the writer of this letter. And when I first read that as a very young man, I thought, oh, so Paul didn't write it, Tertius wrote it. And the answer is Paul is probably striding to and fro in a room somewhere, speaking rather fast, and Tertius is trying to get it all down. I wonder if some of you have been doing that this last hour or two. There were forms of shorthand developed in the ancient world. We know that Cicero had a slave who was a very highly qualified slave who astonished people a century before Paul's day because he could take down an entire conversation. He developed a system of shorthand. I do not know how widespread that was. I don't think we have that information in Paul's day, a century after Cicero, but the use of scribes was the norm, and so Paul would almost certainly be dictating. However, he's in prison. Maybe some of what he's doing is actually written in his own hand. He certainly in some letters signs the letters in his own hand. The end of Galatians, he says, see what large letters I'm writing in my own hand, which implies that other people have written at his dictation. But it wouldn't surprise me if we were finally to discover, I don't know how, that in prison Paul had in fact been scribbling stuff and had given it to some friend to make a fair copy, especially because new copies had to be made if it was going to go out in all directions, as I think Ephesians did. So I think Paul's norm would be to dictate, and that there would be friends, colleagues who would have scribal gifts, and he would be, you see, and I'm doing it myself, I'm interrupting my own sentence. Paul sometimes does exactly that, and he does it in Ephesians 3. Suddenly he breaks in and says, by the way, I assume that you know, blah, 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 blah. And the scribes go with the flow. And sometimes they must have thought, I hope they're going to make sense of this. If you've studied Romans 5, you'll know whole sentences without subjects or verbs or objects, just splashy words all over the place. But so I think they're scribes, but Paul is going full tilt. So it doesn't mean that the thing has necessarily been tidied up, as often it hasn't been.
Right, thank you. Along the same theme, related, you mentioned that you're convinced of the Pauline authorship of Ephesians, despite other scholars disagreeing. How significant do you believe the question of authorship is for the ministry and sermons of pastors and the life of the church?
Yeah, I do think it's important because again and again, I mean, there are certain aspects of Ephesians and Colossians, not least the household codes, which people have said, oh, well, Paul, that probably wasn't Paul. We'll be talking about this when we get to chapter 5. And so people have distanced themselves as though Paul is the one who's genuinely inspired, and if there's something in the New Testament which says it was by Paul but wasn't actually, that enables us to get some critical distance over against it. Actually, if you have a strong theology of scriptural authority, that oughtn't to matter as much as it often does, but people do regularly use that as a way of saying, well, the real Paul got it really right, and then other people writing in his name or imitating him, we can discount that a bit. And I regard that as kind of a thin end of the wedge argument, and I wouldn't want to go there myself.
Got it.